Hello and welcome to a brand new Arseblog Arsecast right here on Arseblog.com. How are you? Hope you're well. Thank you very much indeed, as always, for being here. We're putting this one out early because it's a Euro 2024 themed based conversation today. Some of which refers to what happened last night in the final group games. So I didn't want to wait around until it got even more out of date. Hence the reason the podcast is out today, Thursday. However, I think it would be only right and proper for me to round up all the Arsenal news that's going on right now before we get into this conversation. So here we go. Yep, that's about it. I think covered that in as much detail as possible. Hopefully it was informative, educational, and keeps you up to speed with everything that's going on around Arsenal right now. Never let it be said that we leave you wanting more when it comes to Arsenal news on this podcast. We do have some Arsenal stuff to talk about in a roundabout way, but also in a slightly more specific way in this particular episode. So I'm just going to get on with it. And I'm delighted to welcome back to the show, Tim Stillman. Hello, Tim.
Hello there.
How are you enjoying the European Championships so far? You're an Englishman, so I don't know exactly how invested in the England national team you might be, but are you able to sort of enjoy the football in the way that I have? I'm completely detached from any loyalty to any team, so I'm just in it to see drama, red cards, violence, decent goals, all the things that football gives you without any of the peril.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly how I regard international tournaments, and one of the reasons they're so popular is genuinely because there's no club football on. Because when international football happens during the club season, far fewer people care about it. And so it exists in this space where there's not really any other club football. And so lots more people do get invested in it. I do get invested in the England team, nowhere near as invested as I would be in any sort of Arsenal game, to be fair. But like most people, I'm a tournament glory hunter when it comes to England. And like most people, I have little to no idea what's going on for 11 months of the year with the England team. Definitely don't watch the friendlies. Don't watch all of the qualifiers by any means. But when the tournaments come round, I suddenly have incredibly strong opinions about what England should and shouldn't be doing. And I completely lean into that. It's almost like I'd almost compare tournament football sometimes to watching Friends, in that it's on all the time and it's kind of wallpaper football, like wallpaper TV. You don't have to invest in it too much. You don't even have to watch it too closely if you don't want to. If you want to kind of look at your phone while it's on. Mm-hmm. I've done plenty of that with plenty of the games as well. So yeah, it's one of those things when you're really invested in football and it's your life. Mm-hmm. It's actually quite nice to watch football for relaxation, as it were.
Yeah, I get you. And so you're basically saying that Gareth Southgate is Joey. This is what we're getting at here. Okay.
Yeah.
I see that comparison. I mean, there is a lot going on with England, isn't there? We've been covering it, in more detail every day over on Patreon. And it's been quite interesting to chat to Lewis and also Dan from HLTCO, who's an Englishman as well and is invested in the team and wants them to do well. And I kind of like being able to talk objectively about a football team because, when it's Arsenal, as much as you try and be objective about stuff, you're so wrapped up in the club doing well and the team doing well. It's sometimes hard to do that. And your biases naturally come through a little bit. And we might lean into that in a moment when it comes to Bukayo Saka and some of the bits and pieces that have been going on with him. But, this is an Arsenal podcast. It would be only right for me to to say that I said this on Patreon as well, and it's not just because he's an ex-Spurs player, but for me, Harry Kane is the biggest problem that England have right now. I know there's an issue at left back. I know there's an issue with the balance in midfield, and he's tried Conor Gallagher, he's tried Trent Alexander-Arnold, he's played Kobbie Mainoo there. But for me, the most obvious problem is Harry Kane up front, and the way he tries to play the game, and tries to play the game more or less for himself as much as possible. So, again, maybe with your England hat on rather than your Arsenal versus ex-Spurs hat on, how do you view A, that particular issue, and B, the way that England have performed over the course of the tournament, and how it has been portrayed in the media, who we know it happens when England don't play well. The Graham Taylor turnip thing, it goes back time immemorial where the press will quite happily get stuck in, but this time around there is a measure of expectation that comes with this England team because of what happened in the previous Euros and other tournaments.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is actually I don't think the press have been that savage with the England team. They've been critical, but maybe this just comes down to the way the media is a bit more filtered than when I was a kid, and it was like the Sun newspaper, or for example, had like the primacy around the commentariat around the England team. I'm not saying that they don't have any kind of purchase in the public imagination, but the media feels a bit more finely filtered now, so that you'd get, this sounds like a bit self-aggrandizing. The people I follow and the people I read are all sensible because I'm sensible, but you know what I mean? Like, I think that there's a lot of pretty fair, objective kind of criticism. I'm not seeing that kind of Graham Taylor stuff or stuff about Paul Gascoigne or stuff that I definitely saw when I was a kid. I don't think it's quite as toxic, or at least there are like a greater number of kind of non-toxic options. So what I think is interesting is it, to me, and this probably is more of a social media bubble thing than the actual real world, but it feels like it's coming more from people rather than the press, actually. And I think it's so hard to talk about England, for example, on Twitter. I've likened it to trying to talk about refereeing decisions. Like, it's just impossible. It's impossible to talk about officiating or anything like that, because for exactly the same reasons. A, the starting point is like rage. And we're all there to like similar extents. I'm not excluding myself from that. And it's all so filtered through club bias. And I thought what James said actually on the last Arsecast was quite interesting about how our view of officiating in a tournament is partially governed by the fact that we don't really care about a lot of the teams. So we're okay with like certain decisions that, like there was a handball in the Portugal-Georgia game last night, which, I mean, it happened to Ronaldo, so it was extra funny. But, there was a potential handball call, which if that happened in the Premier League, there'd be a week of discussion about that, which doesn't happen here. So, but when it comes to England, I think that England they've got micro issues and macro issues. The macro issue is I think the manager's been in charge for too long. I don't think anyone should manage the England team for 8 years. I think that's a 4-year job, basically. And I think the World Cup was a tournament too far. And this is late Wenger, early Emery, mid-Emery kind of era Arsenal. This is not working. It needs a new person with a new set of eyes. The micro issue is, I think, the partnerships that kind of worked for Southgate, the chemistry he had in maybe the first half of his reign. So Stones and Maguire. I know people have views on Harry Maguire, the Manchester United defender. Harry Maguire, the England defender, has been pretty good and has been like a good foil for John Stones. That's broken up, although I think Guehi's done pretty well. Then you had like that Rice and Phillips midfield partnership. Nobody is saying that Calvin Phillips is the best midfielder that ever lived, but Declan Rice is much closer to the best midfielder that ever lived, and Calvin Phillips was a nice foil for him. And if you're not going to be the best or world class in a position, the next best thing you can do is be a good partner for the person who is. And I think he was a good partner for Declan Rice, and England haven't cracked that. And the other partnership that made the first half of Southgate's reign reasonably successful was Kane and Sterling, because Kane could go and do his Harry Kane things, rock up in the centre circle, and Sterling would fill that centre forward role pretty well, and that was an effective partnership, and that's been broken up. And essentially, I think the issue England have is that front four doesn't really work, even though all four of the players are really, really good. I just don't think that, like the Kane, Bellingham, that doesn't really work for me. I'm not sure having Saka and Foden as wide players really works. So I think essentially something has to give in that front four. At least one of those players probably has to come out. And to be honest, I think it just needs a new manager now to look at it with a fresh pair of eyes.
I mean, my sense of who that player who might come out is that it could be Bukayo Saka. He is the one that might be, sacrifice is not quite the right word, but it feels like it might be the easiest one for Southgate to make a decision on, because he took him off early the other night, which I think has shown a willingness. Now, I think it's also fair to say there might be a fitness issue with Saka going on at this tournament, because he did miss the final game of the season. He only literally came back in time for the first group game. So some of the decision making about Saka coming off could be informed by his fitness, or, you know, maybe he's managing a problem, you know, which is perfectly normal, I think, for players, but we don't have that information on the outside. And I don't know. I mean, I don't read all the papers every single day, but, you know, I don't know to what extent they're quizzing the manager about fitness and injuries, or to what extent Gareth Southgate is open to giving that information. I just sort of have spent 4 years listening to Mikel Arteta give away nothing about anything when it comes to injury. So now I assume every manager is the same. But I think that Saka conversation, or the Saka debate that sort of went on this week is also quite interesting, because I think Arsenal fans are rightly protective of Bukayo Saka because of some of the treatment that he has had in the media, been front and centre for some back pages which were just not acceptable. And I think that has played a part in this as well. But when Ian Wright makes a suggestion like the one he made the other night, right? And you see some of the reaction to it on social media. I mean, some of the stuff that he was accused of by, I can only assume they're children, but, you know, or idiots, one or the other. But you might not agree with his suggestion, but to say some of the things that they said about him, or what it says about his character, I just cannot, it's beyond the pale to me, to be honest. So I'm not really going to go into it too much. But what he was proposing, I think, was a solution to another problem that England have, which is left back. Mm-hmm. So England have a credible alternative to Bukayo Saka at right wing, which is Cole Palmer. And look, I'm not saying I agree with it. I think Saka is a better player than Cole Palmer. But based on the squad that Gareth Southgate chose, with Luke Shaw as his only left back, and he's injured and hasn't played since February, if you are trying to seek some kind of natural balance, that doesn't seem completely unreasonable to me to suggest that Bukayo Saka could play there and do a pretty good job because of the quality of the player he is. And it's not a question of, well, Saka is, or Palmer is much better than Saka now, so we've got to play Palmer and let's just shoehorn Saka into the team. Like, the mistake is obviously the squad that doesn't have another left back apart from Luke Shaw. But when you're on TV and when you're being asked to examine options for England, there's no point in Ian Wright saying, well, what he should have done was bring this player or that player, because that's no good. He has to try and make some kind of suggestion on what Gareth Southgate could actually do for the next game against Slovakia, and then whatever games that might be coming up for England, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing is for Saka, I'd written about this before, where I think earlier this year I did a column on Saka, and I kind of said he does fly under the radar a bit, because essentially I think his, like, quote unquote superpower, like, he's quick, but he's not like the quickest player. He's strong, but he's not the strongest player. He's skillful, but he's not the most skillful player. Like, he's got a good shot, but he's not got like the best shot. Like, he's really good at everything, basically. And so I'd say, like, Saka's biggest attribute is his brain, and like the academic achievements of the guy, like at school, to get the grades he did when you're a footballer of Bukayo Saka's level, you don't go to school very much.
Yeah.
And it sounds like he was still acing those exams. So I think essentially Saka is one of these people you occasionally encounter in life who's just immensely capable at everything. And I reckon he'd have been a great lawyer. He'd have been a great doctor. He might have been the best barrister in history at like your local Starbucks or whatever. I just think they say something like humans only use 10% of their brains, and like Saka might be one of that 2-3% of people who can use like 12% of their brains or something. And I think about the way he came through at Arsenal. It was largely at left back because that's where Arsenal had a gap at the time. And I think there are wormholes to different universes where Saka became the best left back in the world because Arsenal didn't have a left back. I think there's a universe where Saka becomes one of the best central midfielders in the world because, you know, maybe Granit Xhaka does leave in early 2020 and go to Hertha Berlin, and Arsenal have a gap there. Maybe Saka plays there and becomes a brilliant midfielder. Like, I just think he's one of those guys who could probably play anywhere. And so putting him at left back, don't get me wrong, individually does feel like, as much as left back is still an important role, and particularly if you're England and you kind of have Kyle Walker at right back who can't really get forward anymore and is a bit more your wide centre back, you know, there's license for the left back to go forward. So, and like you said, England have credible options on the right wing as well. So clearly Ian Wright is not saying that Cole Palmer is better than Saka. What he's saying is actually there is a way of Cole Palmer playing and Bukayo Saka playing at left back. And I think the stat that Ian referred to was that Trippier had the second highest number of touches in the England team in this tournament, and that's not because England want that. It's because the opponents want that. So they keep pressing England over to that side. And so I think Ian's argument is, well, either you press England to give the ball to Bukayo Saka, and if Bukayo Saka is the guy having the second most touches, great, or teams stop doing that, and therefore you kind of lose the problem anyway. So I'm with you. I don't think that's the way I'd go. I think maybe Joe Gomez is worth a look at left back, but I really don't think, and this is what I mean about like the tribalism really infecting the discourse, because it's seen as Saka versus Palmer, Arsenal versus Chelsea. I think Arsenal fans before the tournament were doing something very similar to Phil Foden, where it kind of feels like to have Saka's back, I have to like really go in on Phil Foden. And I think this happens everywhere, basically, in the England team. And it's one of those things where when it's like your players, and I don't know if Dan feels like this at the moment, because there's a high level of Crystal Palace representation. Even the manager was at Palace for a long, long time. And like you feel more prickly, like you just do. I remember listening to people, 20 years ago going, oh, Ashley Cole can't defend. And I was like, he can. I watch him every week. He's brilliant. And it took a little while for the kind of penny to drop for people. So when it's your players, it feels like all of a sudden you're sharing them with other people, and you're sharing them with people who don't know them as well as you do, which is why for me, the 2018 World Cup was probably the closest I'd felt to an England team as an adult. And I think that's precisely because there was so little Arsenal representation. It was Danny Welbeck coming off the bench.
Yeah.
And so I didn't feel that kind of, and that extra layer of nerves you feel when your player gets the ball and you think, oh God, if he loses it and they score, everyone's going to have a go at him and everyone's going to say he's rubbish. And, you like nobody can lose. I don't think you can't just shed that tribalism, but some people probably manage it better than others.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a case, that this is an easier thing for Arsenal fans from around the world to comment on more than, let's say, Arsenal fans in England who might also be England fans. And like I said, I completely understand being protective of Bukayo Saka because, he is rightly so. He's a special player and a special guy. And he's already endured a lot out of tournament football when you see the disgraceful racism that he was subjected to after the 2021 final and the penalty miss, and the way that he's responded, is of huge credit to him and his mentality, as you say. But I think when you are in the meat and drink of a tournament, and when you're looking at a team, like I've seen so many things about, like I said, I would drop Kane in a heartbeat. If I were Ollie Watkins or Ivan Toney, I'd be sitting there going, well, what the fuck do I have to do to get 20 minutes? Let alone a start in a game. So I would consider dropping Kane. I've seen people make the case that you've got to drop Jude Bellingham. There's other people talking about bringing Palmer in. I've seen, Trent at right back. Everyone is searching for a solution for England. And none of it is necessarily personal. It just represents the divergence of opinion that you have when it comes to the game of football. Like, how many times has an Arsenal fucking lineup been dropped an hour before kickoff and everyone's like, well, what's he done that for? He's got to play this guy. But, it's just part of how the game and how we experience the game. And, to suggest one thing, one player over another player, doesn't make it personal. It doesn't mean you're sticking the knife into somebody. It doesn't mean that, I despair sometimes at the way it goes on. But maybe that's just social media, though. Maybe that is just a consequence of reading too much shit from people on Twitter,
and it's also, quite interesting in the UK at the moment because we're in a pre-election period as well, and having like a general election at the same time as England not playing very well in a tournament is just like, it's just like, God, both of these discourses are just really, really tiring. And, I'm really only contributing to one of them at the moment. I'm not touching the election. So it kind of felt like that should have been like a kind of a bit of a palate cleanser for the election, but I'm not actually sure that it is. Like, I don't know, there's probably a comparison to be made between like Southgate and either one of Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak.
Let's stick with the Joey from Friends one. I think that's probably a little less contentious. For other Arsenal players in the Euros, it's been an up and down tournament. Obviously, Kieran Tierney out, Alexander Zinchenko now out as well because Ukraine eliminated despite the fact they had 4 points. In their group, Jakub Kiwior also out. So some players are going to get a bit of a rest, but there are others, who are going to hang on for a while. David Raya, Kai Havertz, obviously as well, and the knockout stages look pretty interesting as well. At least we can go back to sort of watching one game at a time, which is a blessing, isn't it? It is difficult because you want to stay on top of everything, but it's hard to pay attention to two things at the same time. Well, at least two football matches at the same time. I'm a bit of an expert in doing something else while I'm doing one thing, but those are different skills that don't apply to podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me as well, the 5 p.m. kickoffs, like, they don't really work for me because like that's kind of nursery pickup kind of time. That period between about 5 and like 7:45, when you have a 3-year-old, they're the mad hours really in the house. So, like, the 2 p.m. kickoffs were wonderful for me. The 5 p.m.s not so much, and there's quite a lot more of those. And particularly, like you say, when there's like 4 games in a day, but they're in 2 time slots. Like, that's because like as a tournament progresses, you kind of go, well, I go from like, I'm watching every single second of every single game. And then for me, around about the end of the second batch of games, it's like, oh, maybe I'll pick up the highlights on this one, or maybe I catch 20 minutes here and there. But then it just all goes out the window when it comes to the third group game, because it's like, I literally can't watch both of these games. And it's weird as well. The format kind of gives and takes away, because on one hand, more teams can go through, which does lend a bit of like, you get far fewer dead rubbers. Like, Wednesday evening, you get, is it Group E, where everyone was on 3 points? But at the same time, teams tend to only need a draw to go through as well. So, like, you're starting to get these kind of really metronomic scorelines of like 0-0, 1-1, 1-0. Like, it feels like you get to the knockout stage a bit earlier. So on one hand, you have fewer dead rubbers, but on the other hand, lots of teams only need a draw. even to finish third in the final group game. So like it feels like that caginess sets in earlier, and then you get kind of not bad but quite average teams who might only need a point to go through. So you end up watching, like I have to say I kind of like it less. And there are some dead rubber games can be great fun. I think Euro 2000, we had France v Netherlands in a group stage, and they played each other in the third game, and they were both through. And it's just one of the best. It was 3-2 to France in the end. Just one of the best games I've ever seen, because they were both through and they both just went,
just had a go.
Fuck it, let's have a go.
Yeah.
And there aren't many of those have a go games anymore.
No, but I think there are some have a go teams in this tournament which have been quite refreshing, because one of the aspects of international football is that managers can't necessarily spend the time required to completely and utterly drill a team to play the football that they might want in their heads. Maybe Austria are a bit of an outlier in that regard, because I think what Ralf Rangnick has done there has been really impressive, and they've been a good team to watch and a very difficult team to play against. I'm really looking forward to their quarter final. But other teams, some lesser lights, if you want to call it that, or some unfancy teams. Georgia, for example, just sort of playing with a kind of, I suppose, a freedom that you don't get, particularly when you've got a very tactically astute manager, a very exacting manager, like Mikel Arteta. And this is not a criticism of him at all, but the way that they play, it feels like football in its purest form, if you want to call it that. And maybe that's doing it a disservice, or maybe that's not respecting the game of football enough. But I've enjoyed watching teams who've gone out to have a go, who understand that in the pecking order, that in the grand scheme of things, man for man, they're not quite at the level of the teams that they're facing. But rather than say, okay, we're going to play 5 at the back, we're going to play 3 in midfield, or 4 in midfield, we'll play 1 up front, we'll deny them the space, we might nick a goal on the counter, we might nick a goal on a set piece. They're like, fuck it, we're here, let's play, let's have a go. And I think there have been some games and performances from those kinds of teams in this tournament that's been really refreshing and enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, Austria are really an exception, because they are basically a club team, in that most of their players came through the Red Bull system, and Ralf Rangnick is literally the person that, like, the godfather of that invented all of that. And so actually what Austria have been able to do, they lost 3, they lost David Alaba, like one of their best players. They lost their goalkeeper, a central midfielder. They've been able to overcome that because the system is the team, which does make them unique. But I think what you kind of pointed to there is it's actually like the fairly middling nations that are the most boring, for want of a better word. So like Czech Republic have been really boring in a couple of their games, and like
Belgium.
Belgium I'd put like a little bit kind of above that, but yeah, and like Slovenia, Slovakia, but then teams like Georgia, because as well what tends to happen, and like Denmark weren't very interesting, because a lot of those teams, what they tend to have is like one star player or something close to that, and what they do is they just play through that star player, and it's like, we're going to play 5-4-1 and we're going to hope this guy does something for us. And those are kind of the most boring international teams, whereas you get the ones that are like a real unit, and it's like, we don't have star players, but that means that we're all going to have to like step up a bit and go for it. And to your point, they don't seem burdened by the weight of expectation like England have been. I've watched all of France's games. I think they've been very heavily burdened. I think the parallels between France and England are very, very stark. I think their manager has been in charge too long, and he's trying to do this thing where he's giving Mbappe a free roll, and I don't think it's really working. And that they need a fresh pair of eyes, and so you get some that are really weighed down by the expectation. But like Georgia, Austria, I resisted calling Austria my dark horses because of their injuries, but I thought they'd go well. I didn't think they'd top their group, and I think to some extent that's kind of been part of this have a go. Let's just have a go. Georgia have done that. So it's really those nations that have really added something to this tournament. And I guess one of the fears about expanding the tournament was having too many teams that, that don't stand a chance or whatever. But I don't actually think that's happened.
No.
There haven't been many whipping boys in this tournament. Did anyone finish on 0 points in the groups or anything? I don't think they did.
I don't think so.
And
Scotland? Oh no, Scotland drew, didn't they? Yeah, I mean,
yeah. They had 1 point. So you're not actually getting the kind of whipping boys, and actually, it's probably more those middle nations that are like, oh my god, let maybe 2 points gets us through, maybe 3 gets us through, but. Like, on one hand, that third place thing can make you play for draws. On the other hand, you can take the view that win one game and that will probably be enough. So when we play a team, maybe when we're playing like Germany or Spain, no, we don't go for it. But like Scotland, for example, they got hammered by Germany. But when they came to play Switzerland, you could see they thought, okay, let's have a swing now because we could beat Switzerland. And if we beat them, that might be enough to put us through.
Yeah.
So, there are real pros and cons of this kind of format. I think those are probably some of the themes we're seeing in this tournament.
We had a question on the Discord. I got a couple of questions from the Discord because it's been a quiet week. And Wise Marklar was asking, do you think the Euros has been excessively physical with a lot of grappling and shirt pulling being allowed? Attackers seem at an all-time disadvantage, which I think is quite an interesting observation because there's been a lot of discussion about the officiating, which, going back to the point that you made about James, like, do you really care what way a decision goes one way or the other if you're entertained by the outcome, like the game last night between Czech Republic and Turkey. Second yellow card for the Czech Republic guy was ridiculously harsh. I don't think he should be sent off for that, particularly in the 19th minute of a game. But I made no difference to me. It became a 10 versus 11 and the referee whipping his cards out all over the place and, lost control and there's a bit of a brawl at the end of it.
Because no one has that, like, bloody Turkey, they get all the decisions because no one watches Turkey.
Yeah, exactly. Or nobody minds, who gets the decision. If you're watching as a neutral observer, unless you're Czech, you're not really going to care one way about that decision. Well, if you're Turkish, obviously you'll be like, well, that's great and that was, good for us. But, the physical side of things, I don't think anything or any real big issues in that regard. The referees do seem a little bit more inclined to let things go. And I think they're sort of trusting, particularly in decisions that come around the penalty box, they're trusting that if they let something go, the VAR is going to kick in, it's going to kick in quickly as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I hadn't consciously noted like the increase in, shall we say, grappling, but I guess we've got a bit of a fashion, whether this is deliberate or a coincidence at the moment. There are a lot of big strikers at the tournament, big man summer, as it were. Wout Weghorst coming out of isolation and just turning up in a major tournament again, and Fulkrug and all these guys. Sesko and who did England play? They had like Vlahovic. They had Vlahovic and Mitrovic. As a front two.
Czech Republic brought on a guy who was like 6'7" last night.
Yeah, exactly. So there's much bigger strikers, and I guess there are some nations as well who don't necessarily, like I was watching Romania in this tournament, and I've forgotten his name now, which I don't really care about because he plays for Spurs, but that Romanian centre-back,
Dragusic.
That's it. Like, you probably get a lot more centre-halves like that in the group stages. Again, like tournaments tend to, like, the group stages and the knockout stages tend to be very different from one another. So a lot of these trends, I think, will disappear. Like, I think it's already starting to disappear, like the long range goals we saw. And there have been loads of own goals as well in this tournament, which I kind of think is probably a coincidence. But yeah, like maybe that has been a bit of a theme just because of like, probably there's more of a predisposition to direct football and up to big strikers. And again, I wouldn't be surprised to see that kind of fade away a little bit in the knockouts.
Yeah, well, we'll wait and see. There are some tasty games in the knockouts, of course, which start on... It's Saturday, isn't it?
Saturday, yes.
Saturday, yeah. Switzerland, Italy and Germany, Denmark on Saturday, and that will continue over the coming days. Right, there's not a huge amount going on from an Arsenal perspective, but a story this week about how certain players have been brought to Marbella, not to have a jolly, but to enjoy a bit of sunshine and some vitamin D. But Ben White, Eddie Nketiah...
was already there.
He was already...
It's just a coincidence they all turned up.
Yeah. He's like, oh, not you guys. Eddie Nketiah, Smith Rowe, Fabio Vieira, Jurriën Timber and Reece Nelson are the players involved. We had a question on the Discord from Simon King. What do the reports of the 6 players joining up with Michelin in Marbella tell you about the plans for those players this season? Or do they tell us anything about the plans or more about their availability at this point of the summer?
Yeah, they probably do. Like those are the guys that just aren't at the tournament, right?
Yeah.
With the exception of Ødegaard. This is where it's interesting. Ødegaard's coming a bit later. Mm-hmm. So I wonder whether, like with Ben White, like I say, he was just already there and just on holiday. But like he clearly had physical issues over the season, which he didn't show. But we know he was carrying a bit of a knock. So for him, maybe it's that, whereas Ødegaard probably wasn't, which is why he's going a bit later. The other guys, it probably is about tuning them up. They didn't get a lot of football last year, so they probably don't need a rest, like a long rest, quite as much. So, and someone like Smith Rowe, I mean, I swear he's turned up early for pre-season every year for the last 3 years now. Which is good. Sorry, I made that sound a bit pejorative, but
fuck him turning up early, showing dedication and professionalism. What's the story with this guy?
But and like Eddie as well. Like if you follow Eddie on Instagram, let's just say he doesn't seem to have spent his holiday how I might spend a holiday.
I'm not having an arm wrestle against Eddie Nketiah. That's all I can say. Looking at some of those pictures.
No, exactly. And Eddie's someone as well who clearly has been working on his upper body strength, let's say. So, like players like that who maybe have slight physical issues, Fabio Vieira, we know he had an operation last season, but really, I don't think there's that much in it other than these are the guys who are not at tournaments. And then maybe there's a couple of guys there who are managing issues, whereas Ødegaard's coming a bit later. Maybe he's still mourning the fact that Kai Havertz hasn't come home yet. I don't know.
That's it.
That's an interesting bromance I didn't see coming. It's weird, isn't it, when you see that and then you think, oh, I didn't know about that. But then, of course, like it...
Why would you? Yeah.
Why would you know about it? But maybe there's an element of tuning these guys up for sale, but also... Really, I think there's probably a more logical point behind it, which is that, the US tour and things like that, guys are going to be joining a bit later and we need to be able to turn a team out in some of these games. And those guys are going to be playing likely purely out of numbers. So it probably makes sense for them to start their pre-season now. And if they want, to make some of those guys attractive in the market, it's probably better if we're trying to sell them in good condition. I don't think it's quite as good if they're like just sitting on the beach until August the 31st.
No.
So, there's probably just a logical, these guys are going to be playing in 3 weeks in LA or whatever. So, I wouldn't read too much into that other than maybe Ben White was carrying a bit of an issue and they want to check on him.
Yeah, and I guess as well that pre-seasons and player fitness and physical condition is now at a point where, this is very well planned and very strategic, and you want to, this discussion last year was kind of about, or it was one of the discussions last year was, in the previous couple of seasons, it felt like Arsenal ran out of steam. Now, there were other reasons. I think it was a question of running out of legs, running out of actual players at times, but also could Arsenal go the distance in, physically, could this team go the distance in the Premier League? And I think they did. And I think Arteta is a guy who looks to make improvements all along the way, and this might be just another way of ensuring that these guys are as fit as they can be if and when they're needed for Arsenal. Because, as you say, I think there are some question marks over some of those players. Stories about Smith Rowe being of interest to Fulham and Crystal Palace, which, listen, if I listened to the pod that Elliot did with Kieran Maguire on the PSR rules, and it's very interesting, isn't it, that Arsenal and Crystal Palace could do a deal for Eze if Eze is available, and Arsenal could value Emile Smith Rowe at something, and Crystal Palace could, there's the release clause for Eze, but from an accounting perspective, I'm not saying this is why deals will happen, but there are interesting aspects to all of these deals. So there was another story during the week that Arsenal have valued Eddie Nketiah at £50 million. And you're like, well, I mean, good. I don't think you're getting £50 million for Eddie Nketiah, but what if there was a player at a club that Arsenal had an eye on, and as part of the deal in the financial process, Eddie Nketiah is valued at £50 million in that deal. I'm not saying it's right, and I do think there is something a little bit grotty about some of the financial aspects of some of these deals, but I did wonder when I saw that Eddie is being valued at £50 million thing, whether that was put out there in the ether to sort of, I don't know, lay the groundwork for one of those deals that doesn't look great from a moral perspective, but which is, on paper at least right now, not breaking any rules.
Yeah, and it's going to be really interesting because these are obviously like quite big loopholes. Because one of the things about PSR is it's actually been around for a long time. And I think it kind of came in on the back of Portsmouth imploding and Premier League clubs getting together and kind of saying, well, we don't really want this to happen to us. But obviously the rules are probably not entirely fit for purpose. And like the thing is about them is essentially when they set this, you can lose £35 million a year. When those regulations were brought in, that was seen as a preposterous number. It was almost like Neymar's release clause at Barcelona.
Yeah.
Like, we'll set it at 200 million. No one's going to pay that. And then someone does. And now all of a sudden, there are some teams that really seem to want to be able to lose hundreds of millions of pounds. And then understandably, there's a lot of clubs who are like, no, we don't. There's not really much point in being in the Premier League if the price of staying in is to basically liquidate ourselves. So there are some of these loopholes that I think need closing. But at the same time, clubs will have to vote to close them, which will be quite interesting. So, yeah, it could be, let's say for accounting purposes, I pay you, barkeep, £87 for this pint of lager, but you give me £80 change, kind of thing going on. And that's, that while that's happening. So you could be right. It could be about, like, Palace are about to lose Michael Elise, maybe someone like Eze comes on the market or whatever. Maybe Fulham are about to lose Paulinho, for example, and maybe that gives them a little bit of money before the end of this accounting period. And what's interesting as well is I think the reason you're not seeing anything from Arsenal at the moment is because clearly they need to wait until July the 1st to actually do anything. So there's loads of this going on, and it just seems to be. And one of the other reasons the PSR stuff didn't really kick in was because there was a grace period granted in 2020 with COVID, where basically the Premier League kind of said for the next 3 years, we're calling this off because
everyone's making a loss. Yeah,
everyone's losing loads of money because there's no fans. So there was like a 3-year grace period granted, which expired in 2023, and then there's also like what Premier League clubs regard as the threat of a government regulator for football, and so football is trying to show no, we don't need a regulator. So they've started enforcing these rules, and it's all like so interesting. But I actually hadn't thought of that maybe it might be a bit of a PSR ruse. I was thinking more maybe Arsenal were trying to get tough in the market trying to say, well, we'll say 50 million. We know we won't get that, but maybe we'll get more by saying this. And actually, maybe that's a reaction to some of these deals we're seeing where you can apparently score like 5 goals in the under-23 league and be a £20 million player. You know how those clubs like were quoting ridiculous prices because of Anthony.
Yeah, well, that's it.
Maybe this is us saying, well, okay, if this guy who scored 7 goals in the under-23 league is worth 19 million, our guy who's actually played Premier League football and scored in the Premier League is worth 50 million. Maybe like it's a reaction to that.
It could well be, a bit of kite flying maybe, but also, a rising tide lifts all boats, even if the tide is completely artificial, I guess. But then so was, the money that was paid for Neymar, and that had a significant impact on the transfer market. So, we'll have to wait and see. The idea, though, that the Premier League clubs will come together now and make votes given what's been going on behind the scenes, this Man City thing that's going on. Certain clubs, as we know, are more aligned with Man City because, well, it's in their interests, whether it's short-term financial or long-term like Newcastle. If Man City are successful in their legal bid, I mean, the biggest winner in that whole scenario is Newcastle, right? Because they've got multiples of the worth of Manchester City. And if they can spend freely, it'll be like, well, I don't really want to move to Newcastle. It's a bit kind of northeasty for me. No, thank you. Well, what about this? Come here for 4 years and we'll just fucking pay you X. And it's like, well, okay, I'll build my own indoor sun then, and my own indoor beach in my. There are these aspects to what's going on, I think, that are quite interesting because, for some people, within, I suppose, their own confines, there is a measure or a need for sporting integrity or whatever. Whereas we know the whole Manchester City product has been product is right. I meant to say project, but product is right.
It's a telling Freudian slip.
It surely is. Has been set up, to sort of do away with that. So we'll see what happens. Just back to Smith Rowe. I mean, Fulham, Palace. I mean, they seem like clubs that would be a good fit for him now. Like, football can surprise you, and a guy can look like he's out the door and he can come back in and maybe make a case and make a claim for a first team place. I'd be very surprised if Smith Rowe played regularly and often for Arsenal again. I think it's a shame because I really like him as a player, but it would be a bigger shame, I think, if he spent another season just not playing. So in terms of those clubs and their interest in him, they do seem like a good fit to me.
Yeah, and they make sense because of the players those clubs are losing. So, Palace have basically already lost Michael Elise. They might lose Eze as well. And that leaves a space for a player exactly like Smith Rowe, essentially. And Fulham have been playing Willian, our old friend, on the left. So they've liked playing like a kind of inverted left winger. And I'm really interested in why Arteta lost interest in the idea of Smith Rowe playing out wide as a wide creator. Maybe he just doesn't want that type of player anymore, but these clubs have kind of been playing with that type of player. So as well as being, geographically convenient, they can probably pay the salaries. They're about to get reasonable income in sales themselves. Like, those do feel like kind of reasonable punts for him at the moment. I think his Arsenal race was run a little while ago, and I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago. I actually, looking back at Arteta's comments, I'm not even sure it's that injury related. I just think that he's always thought this is going to be an upgradable guy at some point in my tenure. Maybe in 2021, when his contract was coming up, he wasn't the most immediate quote unquote issue, and it was a bit expedient. Maybe a bit like Kieran Tierney. Maybe it's a bit like, okay, this guy's not a problem in my team at the moment. I've got other stuff to get to, but really in 2 or 3 years, this guy's probably going to be surplus. And I kind of think that's where we've got with Smith Rowe, that essentially he's just bought a load of players he prefers. Yeah. And that there's not really a lot more to it than that, if that makes sense.
It does. I think as well, when you look back at some of the comments that Mikel Arteta's made about Emile Smith Rowe, he doesn't tend to go into a lot of depth on players. But with Smith Rowe, there have been these comments about, he's learned a lot from his last injury. He's learned how to, I'm paraphrasing here, about how to train properly now and things like, he's understood what it means to be a professional and how to manage your diet better. And these kinds of things that he said about him that I've never really heard him say about any other player. And I'm not sure if it's carrot and stick or, right, I'll make this public comment so he can respond to it, those kinds of things. But it hasn't happened, obviously, with Saka. It hasn't happened with Martinelli. Even when there was a little bit of doubt about Martinelli, it was like, he's a fantastic player, but he's had a big injury. We just have to be careful about how we integrate him. Those kinds of things haven't really happened with any other of those players. Compare and contrast the way he's always spoken about Eddie Nketiah, for example. He trains like a demon, and Eddie's a fantastic player. There's never been any sort of like, right, I've got to give this guy a little poke in the right direction.
Yeah, even when Smith Rowe signed the contract, he kind of intimated that he didn't feel he was ready to take on the number 10 shirt. He was like, I'd like, essentially with Arteta's comments about Smith Rowe, you've kind of got to look at the question as well. And quite often he raises things that he had, like no one asked him about Smith Rowe. Like the question was not, is Smith Rowe crap at training? Like he chose to bring that up, whether it was to send a message or whether it was subconscious, I don't know. But when he signed the contract as well, he was like, I'd rather a player ask for something he's not ready for, which was when he could have just said about the number 10 shirt, we're fighting. Or, like, I was just expecting him to say it's just a number, it doesn't really matter. Yeah. But, like, for him to say, well, I'd rather a player ask what he's not ready for, it's like, oh, so you don't think he's ready for that? I always found that a slightly weird comment. And even after he played against Luton in April and he got man of the match, and he was just asked in very general terms about Smith Rowe's performance, and he said, he's playing really well and he was passing forwards all the time. And again, the question was not, did Smith Rowe pass forwards enough for you? He wasn't asked about that at all, but it was clearly on his mind. It was clearly something that he'd spoken with the player about, and maybe where he had a level of dissatisfaction about his kind of his willingness to take risks with the ball. And it's just always felt to me like there's a distance there. And to be honest, you've only got to look at what he's done in the transfer market. Ever since Smith Rowe came into the team, Ødegaard was still bought, Vieira was still bought, Trossard was still bought. Like, I think if he really thought Smith Rowe was a first 11 Arsenal player, at least one of those transfers doesn't happen. I think really the Occam's razor here is that he just hasn't really ever fancied him as a player.
Yeah, maybe so. We'll have to get Fabio Vieira into the same gym as Eddie Nketiah, by the way. He could use a bit of that. Just a final one. This is slightly tongue-in-cheek from the Laughing Gooner, who says, has Declan Rice caused more squad problems than he solved? Does he play at 6 or 8? Do we sign a 6 or 8? Is Havertz an 8 or a 9? Has Martinelli plateaued? All problems brought about by Rice's squad standing. And like I said, I think that is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it does feel like maybe the big decision Arsenal have to make this summer when it comes to the transfer market is Declan Rice adjacent, if that's the right way to put it. Like, I don't think they're just going to say, right, from now on he's only going to play 6, or from now on he's only going to play 8. But there is probably going to be a decision made on where you mostly want him to play. And I accept as well that it is maybe for this summer as well linked to other moves and other players, because there is an abundance of 6s. If Rice is a 6, then so is Jorginho, and so is Thomas Partey, which leaves you in need of an 8. But if Rice is an 8, maybe you lean into those two, etc., etc. But I'm sure they're probably behind the scenes a bit more clear on this than we might be right at this moment in time. So what happens in the window with midfield will probably tell us more, because Mikel Arteta is not going to come out and say it himself. He's not going to come out and have a press conference and say, we have decided that Declan Rice is going to be X, Y, or Z, you know?
Yeah, and it's interesting because we kind of, I realise the question's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but we see it as a problem because we just talk about it so much. But it's not a problem for a manager to have guys who can do, and the multifunctionality of the players Arteta has bought has given Arsenal real resilience in the market. So when someone like Benjamin Sesko doesn't happen, Arsenal don't have to go out and try and find another Benjamin Sesko. They can pivot to a winger, and we've seen this before, right? Like, we couldn't get Lisandro Martinez, so we got Zinchenko. We couldn't get Mudryk, so we got Trossard. And I think something similar might happen here. It just gives Arsenal that flexibility to say, okay, this exact profile isn't available, but we've got a multifunctional enough squad to flip to another profile if we need to. So I don't think Mikel Arteta would consider that a problem. For me, I'm pretty clear on what I think Declan Rice is, and I think the way we think of the Arsenal midfield is a little bit like, we think of it as a 3, and I don't. I think of it as a 4. So the way it kind of works in my eyes is that when Arsenal don't have the ball, it's a box. So Havertz kind of comes back into that left 8 role, if you will. Ødegaard's in the right 8, and then you've got Declan Rice as like a left 6, I guess, and then either Jorginho or Partey next to him in that kind of right 6. So I think it's a box and it's a double pivot. When Arsenal don't have the ball, when they do have the ball, I think it turns into a diamond, and Rice has the kind of freedom to run into that kind of left channel. I think that's what Rice is. I think that's what we should make him. I think he's much more, because he's got the energy basically to be a 6 and an 8 at the same time. And I kind of think that's what he is. And I think what he needs next to him is a Jorginho or Partey, kind of a right sort of player who veers to the right, who's more of a playmaker. This goes back into the England discussion as well. And what England don't have is that player. They don't have that kind of sitting playmaker, if you will. That kind of, if you're thinking absolute top class, Pirlo, Xabi Alonso, maybe even Arteta himself type player, that kind of, when it becomes a diamond, sits, essentially. So I think that's the player Arsenal should go for. I think that's probably more the player they'd like. I think they'd probably like to move Thomas Partey on, bring in that kind of right-sided guy who basically a young Jorginho, I think, is what Arsenal would really, really like. Whether that guy's available, don't know. But yeah, I think of Rice as much more of I think it's a slight waste, not an enormous waste, but a slight waste of his biggest attribute, which is just his energy, his ability to eat up ground and win the ball back. And if he can do that on the halfway line rather than the edge of his own box, both are good. And I think he can do both of those things. But, winning it back maybe slightly higher up and having that space to expand into big space. That's what I think we've fallen on with Declan Rice and kind of what he is. And maybe that does mean that Havertz is more of a striker, but Arsenal will still have the flexibility to do both things. Yeah. So they can play Havertz a bit deeper in midfield and have Rice as the 6 if they want to. But I think the team you saw at the end of the season is kind of more probably what Arsenal want. And the fact that their first forward target was a guy like Sesko says to me they were kind of looking for another Havertz, maybe like someone else who can do that role as well. So I'm interpreting here, and I might be wrong, and Arsenal might have cause to pivot away from this, but it strikes me that Arsenal fell on something in the second half of the season that Arteta likes and would like to keep. Yeah,
what's the thing? Sometimes a player tells you where he should play or wants to play is what Arteta said. I thought the links in midweek to Mikel Merino were quite interesting, not least because I saw a stat. I didn't mention this on the one of the Patreon pods, but in the 2023-24 campaign, Merino won the most duels for possession in Europe's top leagues. Seems to fit a particular bill there because we know Mikel Arteta absolutely loves his players to win duels. Anyway, we will see. Like you said, I don't think anything's happening until July 1st at the very, very earliest. Get this accounting period out of the way, move some money around, and then see what we can do in the market. But for now, we better leave it there. Tim, thanks very much.
My pleasure as always.
Thank you to Tim. You can find him on Twitter. He is at Stillmanator. That is at Stillmanator. Right. There isn't much else going on. Just a reminder that we are doing podcasts around Euro 2024 over on Patreon. If you'd like to get involved, if you'd like instant access, which helps support everything that we do on Arseblog, by the way. Remember, the entire website is ad-free. So if you like what we do and you like to support it and get a load of extra content all year round, look at patreon.com/Arseblog. That's patreon.com/Arseblog. It's $6 a month. The price is the same as it was when we launched it back in 2019, 2020. So it's not rising with inflation, but what you get is certainly inflating your podcast app or something. I really should have thought about that before I said it out loud. Anyway, thanks again for being here and for listening. Hope you have a great weekend. We will have an Arsecast extra for you, but it's going to be on Tuesday because James has gone to Glastonbury. I just had a quick look at the Glastonbury website there. There's a fucking lot going on there. Jesus. But who was it? Who was it that tempted James into getting tickets to run the risk of trench foot if it rains and to endure the queues for everything from toilets to hot dogs? Now, I can't say for sure, but I'm pretty certain it's the Sugar Babes or Cyndi Lauper. I'll ask him on Tuesday, assuming, of course, that he has recovered sufficiently to speak more than his own name. If you are going to Glastonbury this weekend, have a wonderful time. To the rest of you, whatever you're doing, have a wonderful time as well, and we will catch you on the next one. Until then, cheers. Bye-bye.